comments from Mr. Myerson and then Mr. Zingales.
George Bush certainly talks a lot about fostering the spread of democracy and freedom in the world, and so does George Soros. I didn't carry the book over. I wanted to wave it around because it's a good book. It's very interesting. I think what I've learned to see in it is the difference is that for Mr. Bush, it's axiomatic that freedom and democracy are virtues of American civilization that can be expected to follow American influence wherever it goes. But for Mr. Soros, freedom and democracy are mutable characteristics of a dynamic social system. They cannot be, in his view, achieved or even understood without a perpetual process of open questioning and wide multilateral debate. As a scholar, I have to admit I have a vested interest in the idea that a worthy social goal requires perpetual analysis and discussion. But I really do think that Mr. Soros is profoundly correct here. He talked just now about the need to find positive, constructive ways to cultivate democracy in the world. I think one of the book's great strengths is that he really does give detailed discussion to a variety of different ways to cultivate freedom and democracy through the world, through new structures and international relations. And I urge people to look at this. What I'd like to suggest in commentary on it is to go a little further in at least one direction, talk about inside of Iraq and since the occupation, and also follow him and talk a little bit about limits to American use of force as a systematic question. This detailed discussion of the kind that he does on international relations in the book, detailed discussion of the strategies that America could have applied in its mission to cultivate freedom and democracy in occupied Iraq after the war, was an absolutely central question that got almost no serious consideration either by the Bush administration or by its critics. There is much more that obviously that I can say here today. But talking as a social scientist who, as many of us do here, studies the theory of democracy, let me suggest from the first there's been vastly too much talk about keeping power from, quote, radical Islamists or, quote, Baathists, because freedom and democracy we obviously need to understand not as being embodied in any particular kind of person, but they are systematic properties of a social system. The question should have been, how can such a democratic operating system be started in Iraq? One of the first principles of democracy, of course, is that military forces must be subservient to elected leaders. You know that something's wrong when we started building a new Iraqi army before there had been any elections. Obviously, if national elections, there was serious concerns, very real concerns, if national elections were held in Iraq tomorrow or yesterday, the winner would have had every incentive to use his new national power to begin suppressing opportunities for other political groups. So I think our occupation authorities, which I suppose are a mystery to all of us outside of Baghdad, saw two alternatives: using their power to install a puppet strongman, or clearing the way for an anti-American dictatorship. And the default that they seem to have chosen was to cultivate was a policy of a safe colonial administration, marking time until a date of turning over power. The problem is that they didn't follow. There's no questioning of systems. Society is a complex system, and there's always another way to think about it. Imagine what would have happened if, for example, instead of talking about a national constitution, national elections, we'd allowed local and provincial councils to be freely elected throughout Iraq in the months following the war. Provincial leaders would have had much more incentive to respect democratic civil rights in hopes of building a reputation that could appeal to voters throughout the country. Ambitious politicians could begin building their reputations by responsible government, providing public goods rather than by extremist rhetoric or paramilitary activity. Unfortunately, you look at the incentives, emigre leaders had very little or no incentive to advocate such a decentralized start to democracy, and American administrators had little inclination to think seriously about alternative strategies. As Mr. Soros has argued, we needed to stop confusing America with freedom and democracy and begin the hard task of thinking very carefully about what freedom and democracy really mean. The other point I would like to make quickly is, in his book, he persuasively argues that America would be better off defining its role as the leader of the free world rather than as the world's only superpower. And it's a fine distinction, but a beautiful one. To be leader of the free world is to negotiate partnerships of trust with other nations. But such partnerships, any such partnerships, have to be based on mutual acceptance of constraints by all the partners involved. American diplomatic activity since 9/11 and the War of Iraq was not merely heavy-handed, it was based on a systematic refusal to admit any constraints on America's unilateral use of force. Many arguments were offered to justify our invasion of Iraq, but none depended on any validation of the outside of the leadership in Washington, D.C. As Mr. Soros rightly emphasizes, the idea of self-imposed constraints is fundamentally alien to the thinkers who dominate American foreign policy today. I'd like to go and characterize that as a classic error of extrapolating from decision theory into what's fundamentally game theory. In decision theory, a person never gains by imposing constraints on himself. In game theory, a constraint on one player's behavior can change other people's behavior in a way that ultimately benefits them all. Unfortunately, the president brilliantly understands that it's hard to explain why accepting international constraints can make America safer, that this argument is hard to sell in the sound bites of an election campaign, but that doesn't make it false. In the long run, America's status as an unrivaled superpower can persist only as long as other nations in the world accept it without challenge. When American forces invade one country after another, people everywhere must ask what keeps them from becoming another American target. In countries where there is no clear answer to this question, politicians will seek military deterrence against America because people everywhere demand leaders who can promise security. I think the rhetoric should focus at some point on the greatest danger, which is, as it has in 2004, we should remember the dangers also of an earlier generation of acting too arrogantly like Kaiser Wilhelm. Bismarck's successes in his foreign policy were based on an understanding that a country with overwhelming military superiority can become more secure by accepting some constraints from the international community to reassure its neighbors. Wilhelm ignored this simple fact disastrously at the turn of the 20th century, and he provoked a counterforce against him that became World War I. When we worry about the safety of our civilization in the 21st century, this may perhaps be a more relevant analogy for Americans to think about in 2004.